Good morning. I want to begin today by saying something that I think often gets lost in the noise of political commentary and the rapid cycle of headline driven economic discourse. Trade policy is not theater. It is not a performance. It is not a negotiating bluff to be deployed casually in a press conference or a social media post. Trade policy is the architecture upon which two of the world's most deeply integrated economies have built decades of shared prosperity, mutual dependency, and coordinated growth. And when that architecture is treated as a prop, when it is mocked, dismissed, or weaponized for short term political leverage, the consequences are not abstract. They are felt in supply chains, in employment figures, in energy markets, in the long run trajectory of GDP on both sides of a border that has historically been the most economically productive bilateral relationship in the history of the modern world. I want to speak today about Canadian oil. Not because it is a politically convenient topic, and not because I am interested in scoring points in what has become an increasingly unproductive and, frankly, damaging rhetorical war between Washington and Ottawa. I want to speak about Canadian oil because it is one of the most consequential and consistently underappreciated components of North American energy security, and because the recent pattern of dismissiveness, the mockery, if I may use that word plainly, that has been directed at Canada's energy sector from certain quarters of American political leadership represents, in my professional and analytical judgment, one of the most significant own goals in the recent history of United States trade and energy policy. Let me provide the context that this conversation demands. Canada is not a peripheral supplier of energy to the United States. Canada is, by every measurable metric, the single largest foreign supplier of crude oil to the American economy. In 2023, the United States imported approximately 3.9 million barrels of oil per day from Canada. To put that number in perspective, that figure exceeds the combined oil imports from every other nation on earth that sells crude to the United States. Saudi Arabia, Mexico, Iraq, Nigeria, none of them, individually or in combination with one another, come close to matching the volume that flows southward across the Canadian border every single day. The pipelines that carry that oil, through Alberta, through Saskatchewan, into the refineries of the Midwest, the Gulf Coast, and beyond, are not just infrastructure. They are the circulatory system of a shared continental energy economy that has been built, refined, and deepened over the better part of half a century. When I hear Canadian oil described in dismissive terms, when I hear the suggestion, implicit or explicit, that Canada's energy sector is somehow leverageable, that it can be mocked or marginalized without consequence, I am not merely troubled from a diplomatic standpoint. I am troubled from a deeply pragmatic, analytically grounded economic standpoint. Because the data does not support that posture. The data, in fact, directly contradicts it. And when political rhetoric diverges this sharply from economic reality, it is the responsibility of those of us who work in the domain of serious economic policy to say so clearly, without equivocation, and without apology. Now, I want to be careful here. I am not interested in assigning blame in a partisan fashion. That is not my role, and it is not a productive use of the analytical framework that I believe this conversation requires. What I am interested in is tracing the sequence of decisions and statements that have brought us to the current moment, and examining, with the rigor and honesty that the American people deserve, what the economic consequences of those decisions are likely to be, and indeed, in several important respects, already are. The posture of dismissiveness toward Canadian energy did not emerge in a vacuum. It emerged from a broader political tendency to treat trade relationships as zero-sum contests, as bilateral arm wrestling matches in which the goal is dominance rather than mutual benefit. This is a fundamental misreading of how modern integrated economies actually function. The United States and Canada do not simply trade with one another in the way that two strangers might exchange goods at a marketplace. Our economies are structurally intertwined in ways that make clean separation not just difficult, but in many sectors, functionally impossible without significant disruption and cost to both parties. The automotive sector is perhaps the most cited example of this integration, but the energy sector is equally, and I would argue more immediately, illustrative. Canadian oil, particularly the oil sands production of Alberta, is not a commodity that the United States can simply replace with a phone call to another supplier. The heavy crude that flows from Alberta is specifically calibrated to the refining infrastructure that American companies have spent billions of dollars building and optimizing, particularly along the Gulf Coast. These refineries were designed deliberately and at enormous capital expense to process heavy crude. They are not easily or cheaply retooled to handle lighter grades of oil. This means that even if the United States were to dramatically increase domestic production of lighter shale oil, which itself carries significant cost, environmental, and logistical challenges, it would not straightforwardly substitute for Canadian heavy crude in the refining system that currently exists. The infrastructure mismatch alone represents a constraint that no amount of political rhetoric can engineer away. This is what I mean when I say that mocking Canadian oil is not merely impolitic. It is analytically unsound. It reflects a failure to understand the physical and economic realities of the energy system that the United States currently depends upon. And Canada, to its considerable credit, has not simply absorbed this posture with passive acceptance. Canada has responded methodically, strategically, and with a long term orientation that I find, from a policy perspective, genuinely instructive. Prime Minister Carney's government has moved with notable speed and strategic clarity to begin reorienting Canadian energy export infrastructure away from exclusive dependence on the American market. The expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which now carries Canadian oil to the Pacific coast for export to Asian markets, represents a structural shift in Canada's energy export geography. It is not a shift that happened overnight, and it is not a shift that will fully materialize in a single fiscal quarter. But it is a shift that is now irreversible in its foundational architecture, and its long-run implications for the leverage dynamics of the Canada-US energy relationship are profound and, from the American perspective, should be sobering. I want to pause here and make a point that I consider essential to any honest accounting of where we are. The United States has for many years benefited from a Canada that was, for geographic and infrastructural reasons, heavily dependent on American markets for the sale of its energy production. That dependency gave the United States a degree of implicit pricing and political leverage that was rarely made explicit, but was always present in the background of bilateral negotiations. Canadian oil had limited alternative buyers because Canadian oil had limited alternative routes to those buyers. The Trans Mountain expansion changes that equation in a fundamental way. And the irony, the deeply instructive irony, is that the rhetoric of dismissiveness and mockery accelerated Canada's motivation to make that change. In attempting to leverage Canada's dependency, the approach instead catalyzed Canada's effort to eliminate that dependency. That is not a good outcome for American energy interests, and I think it is important to say so directly. I will have considerably more to say about the specific mechanisms of Canada's strategic response, the economic data that illuminates the stakes involved, and the policy path forward that I believe serves the genuine long-term interests of the United States economy. But I want to close this first section of my remarks by returning to the foundational point with which I began. Trade policy is not theater. The decision to treat a $900 billion bilateral trade relationship, the largest such relationship in the world, as a platform for political performance has consequences. Those consequences are now becoming visible in the data, in the markets, and in the strategic repositioning of a partner nation that the United States can ill afford to push into the arms of competing global powers. That is where we are. And in the sections that follow, I intend to explain in precise terms exactly what it means and what it will cost. Let me turn now to the specific economic mechanisms through which the dismissal of Canadian oil has begun to register its costs, not in the abstract language of diplomatic friction, but in the concrete, measurable terms of market behavior, capital allocation, and strategic realignment. Because I think it is important that the American public and indeed American policymakers understand that we are not speaking here about hypothetical future risks. We are speaking about processes that are already underway, decisions that have already been made, and structural shifts that are already being locked in by actors on the Canadian side who have drawn rational, evidence based conclusions from the signals that American policy has sent them. Let me begin with capital markets, because capital markets are often the earliest and most sensitive registrar of policy driven economic change. When the rhetoric of dismissiveness toward Canadian energy began to escalate, when tariff threats were layered on top of dismissive commentary about the value and relevance of Canadian oil to the American energy system, Canadian energy companies and the institutional investors who fund them began, quite rationally, to reassess their exposure to the American market. This reassessment did not manifest as panic. Canadian energy markets are mature, sophisticated, and inhabited by large, well capitalized institutions with long investment horizons. What it manifested as was a quiet but systematic reorientation of capital allocation decisions toward projects and infrastructure that reduce dependence on American market access and increase optionality in global export markets. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion is the most visible expression of this reorientation, but it is far from the only one. Canadian liquefied natural gas infrastructure on the Pacific coast has seen increased investment interest. Discussions about pipeline capacity expansion toward eastern Canadian ports, with an eye toward Atlantic export markets, have gained new momentum and political support in provinces that were previously lukewarm on such proposals. These are not small or easily reversible decisions. Pipeline infrastructure, LNG terminals, port facilities, these are capital investments measured in the tens of billions of dollars, with operational lifespans measured in decades. When Canada makes these investments, it is not making a temporary tactical adjustment. It is making a permanent structural commitment to a more diversified export geography. And once that infrastructure exists, the economic logic of using it is self reinforcing and durable. I want to spend a moment on the Trans Mountain expansion specifically, because I think it deserves more analytical attention than it has received in American policy circles. The Trans Mountain pipeline system now has a capacity of approximately 890,000 barrels of oil per day flowing from Alberta to the Westridge Marine Terminal in Burnaby, British Columbia. From there, tankers can carry Canadian crude to refineries in California, to markets in Japan, South Korea, China, and India. The Asian market dimension of this is particularly significant from a geopolitical and economic standpoint. China and India are two of the fastest growing consumers of crude oil in the world. Both nations have been actively seeking to diversify their energy supply chains away from Middle Eastern dependence. Canadian heavy crude delivered via Pacific tanker represents an attractive option for both countries. And the completion of Trans Mountain gives Canada a credible operational mechanism to serve that demand. Now, I want to be precise about what this means for the United States, because I think there is a tendency in some quarters to underestimate the significance of this development. For decades, the structure of North American energy infrastructure meant that Canada had, in effect, one primary customer for its oil exports, the United States. That structural reality gave American refiners significant pricing leverage over Canadian producers. Canadian heavy crude, specifically the Western Canada Select benchmark grade, has historically traded at a substantial discount to West Texas Intermediate, the primary American benchmark, precisely because Canadian producers had limited alternatives and American refiners knew it. The discount between WCS and WTI has at times exceeded $30 per barrel, representing an enormous transfer of value from Canadian producers to American refiners year after year, simply as a function of infrastructure constraint. The Trans Mountain expansion materially changes this dynamic. As Canadian producers gain credible access to Pacific export markets, the structural basis for the WCS discount begins to erode. Canadian producers can credibly threaten, and in many cases execute, the decision to sell their crude to Asian buyers rather than accepting deeply discounted prices from American refiners. This is basic supply and demand economics applied to a market that was previously distorted by infrastructure monopoly. The normalization of the WCS WTI spread is good for Canadian producers and for the Canadian economy broadly. It is less favorable for American refining margins, particularly for the Gulf Coast refineries that have been built around the assumption of access to discounted Canadian heavy crude. This is a direct, quantifiable economic consequence of the infrastructure shift that Canadian policy is now accelerating. And it is a consequence that flows directly from the strategic miscalculation of treating Canadian energy as a target for mockery and political leverage. Let me turn now to the labor market dimensions of this situation, because I believe they are insufficiently appreciated in the current policy debate. The integration of Canadian and American energy sectors is not merely a matter of barrels and pipelines. It is a matter of jobs, American jobs in significant numbers that are directly and indirectly dependent on the flow of Canadian crude through the American economy. The refining sector along the Gulf Coast employs hundreds of thousands of workers, directly and in downstream industries. The petrochemical sector, which uses Canadian crude as a feedstock, employs hundreds of thousands more. The transportation sector, the rail networks, the trucking industry, the pipeline maintenance workforce that moves Canadian crude and its derivatives through the American economy represents yet another substantial layer of employment that is structurally linked to the health of the Canada US energy trade relationship. When I hear Canadian oil discussed in dismissive terms, I think about those workers. I think about the refinery operator in Texas, whose plant was designed and built around the processing of Canadian heavy crude. I think about the pipe fitter in Illinois, whose livelihood depends on the maintenance of infrastructure that carries Alberta oil southward. I think about the petrochemical engineer in Louisiana, whose facility depends on a steady, competitively priced supply of heavy crude feedstock. These are not abstractions. These are real people whose economic security is materially affected by the quality of the Canada US trade relationship, and they deserve a trade policy that takes their interests seriously rather than subordinating those interests to the short term imperatives of political performance. The data on this point is clear. A 2023 analysis by the Canadian Energy Centre, and I cite this not as an advocacy document but as a piece of empirical research that merits engagement on its merits, estimated that Canadian energy exports to the United States support approximately 400,000 American jobs across the refining, transportation, petrochemical, and related sectors. This figure, whatever the precise methodology used to derive it, is directionally consistent with the input-output economics of the sector. Canadian oil is not just a Canadian economic asset. It is a structural input into a significant portion of the American industrial economy, and treating it as though it were a peripheral or dispensable element of that economy reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of the supply chain realities that underpin American manufacturing and energy competitiveness. I also want to address the inflation dimension of this issue because it connects directly to the work that I have spent much of my career focused on, and because it is a dimension that I believe has been almost entirely absent from the public discourse around Canada-US trade tensions. Energy prices are not merely one line item in the Consumer Price Index. They are a foundational input into the cost structure of virtually every sector of the American economy. When energy costs rise, whether because of supply disruption, infrastructure constraint, or the erosion of preferential access to low-cost Canadian crude, those cost increases propagate through the economy in ways that are broad, persistent, and regressive in their distributional impact. They hit lower-income households harder because those households spend a larger share of their income on energy and on goods whose production is energy-intensive. The Federal Reserve spent the better part of 2022 and 2023 engaged in the most aggressive monetary tightening cycle in 4 decades, in significant part because energy price shocks, initially driven by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and subsequent disruption to global energy markets, fed into a broad inflationary surge that proved more persistent and more damaging than initial forecasts suggested. I know this history intimately because I lived it from the vantage point of the Treasury Department, working in close coordination with the Federal Reserve to navigate an extraordinarily difficult macroeconomic environment. The lesson I draw from that experience is not complicated. Energy price stability is a macroeconomic stability issue, not merely an energy sector issue. Policies that introduce unnecessary risk into the energy supply chain, policies that antagonize the largest foreign supplier of crude oil to the American economy, that accelerate that supplier's diversification away from American markets, that erode the pricing advantages that American refiners have historically enjoyed, are policies that carry inflationary risk. And inflationary risk, as the American economy learned painfully in the post-pandemic period, is not a risk that can be managed cheaply or quickly once it has been allowed to materialize. I want to be clear that I am not predicting an immediate or severe inflationary shock as a direct consequence of the current state of Canada-US energy relations. The American economy is resilient, and the adjustment to a changed Canada-US energy dynamic will occur over years, not months. But I am saying that the direction of travel is adverse from an inflation management perspective, and that the cumulative effect of a sustained deterioration in Canada-US energy trade relations, the gradual erosion of preferential access to Canadian crude, the slow upward pressure on refining feedstock costs, the long-run pass-through of those costs into consumer prices, represents a genuine and underappreciated macroeconomic risk that deserves serious analytical attention from policymakers who care about price stability and the long-run purchasing power of American households. That is the economic landscape as I see it from where I stand. In the sections that follow, I will turn to the international dimensions of Canada's strategic response, the way in which Canada's pivot toward Asian energy markets intersects with broader geopolitical competition, and then to the policy framework that I believe offers the most constructive path forward for both nations. But the foundation of everything I will say rests on the analysis I have laid out here, that the dismissal of Canadian oil was not a cost-free political gesture. It was a strategic miscalculation with measurable, ongoing, and in several respects already irreversible economic consequences for the United States. I want to turn now to the international dimensions of this situation because I think it is impossible to fully appreciate the strategic significance of what is happening in the Canada-US energy relationship without placing it in the broader context of global geopolitical competition. We are living through a period of profound restructuring in the international economic order, a restructuring that is being driven by the simultaneous forces of technological change, climate transition, great power rivalry, and the deliberate efforts of multiple nations to reduce their vulnerability to economic coercion by diversifying their trade and investment relationships. Canada's response to American dismissiveness in the energy sector is not happening in isolation from these broader forces. It is, in many respects, a microcosm of them. And the implications for American strategic and economic interests extend well beyond the bilateral Canada-US relationship into the architecture of the global economy itself. Let me begin with China, because China is the actor whose potential expanded role in Canadian energy markets carries the most significant strategic implications for the United States. China is the world's largest importer of crude oil. In 2023, China imported approximately 11.3 million barrels of oil per day from sources around the world, including Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, and a growing roster of other suppliers. China has been systematically and deliberately working to diversify its energy supply base, motivated by a combination of energy security concerns, the desire to reduce dependence on Middle Eastern supply routes that pass through strategic choke points, and the broader ambition to build direct economic relationships with resource-rich nations that reduce Chinese vulnerability to American-led economic pressure. Canadian oil delivered via Pacific tanker routes from the Trans Mountain Terminal in Burnaby fits neatly into this Chinese diversification strategy.